So if there's nothing before we get started, Dorothy, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. For today's webinar, I will be discussing the topics that you see here on this slide. The fiscal year 20 PSAP Grant Program Guidelines, focusing on the NG9-1-1 Migration Program and the PSAP Education Program, the annual progress reporting period, and the fiscal year 18 TrueUp Process. Much of the content that I'm going to cover today is a repeat from the July 11th webinar, but as Steve mentioned in the introduction, we had a request to repeat the content of this webinar or the previous webinar, but I did update the slides to reflect recent developments related to the migration proposals. I hope this is an interactive session, and I invite participants to ask questions either during the presentation or at the end, whichever is the preferred method for the participants. So let's start off talking about the NG9-1-1 Migration Program. There are two programmatic areas contained in the fiscal year 20 guidelines, the NG9-1-1 Migration Program and the PSAP Education Program, also known as the PEP. I'll start off with a review of the NG9-1-1 Migration Program, and I'll cover the PEP later in my presentation. The NG9-1-1 Migration Program is laser-focused on providing grant funding for migration expenses. Estimated migration expenses are captured in the PSAP NG9-1-1 Migration Proposals. When developing the proposal documents, ISP staff looked at PSAP needs for the next 3 years. As a result, we tried to capture any non-vendor supported call handling equipment and planned consolidation projects in the proposal documents, and funding for these projects are as follows. $200,000 for PSAP in a shared services call handling equipment project, $150,000 for an individual PSAP call handling equipment project, and $500,000 for physical consolidation projects. As I said, the NG9-1-1 Migration Program is laser-focused on providing grant funding for migration expenses. I talked about call handling equipment and consolidations as part of the migration proposal development, but the definition for migration expenses is for call routing transitioning to an ESI net during the deployment period. As a result, many items that had been previously funded through the PSAP grant program are no longer eligible for funding. An example would be CAD replacement. A change from previous programmatic guidelines, the NG9-1-1 Migration Program does provide funding to secondary PSAPs, but only to a small number that are currently being served by a selective router pair. So the eligible participants are primary PSAPs and secondary PSAPs currently served by a selective router pair. Secondary PSAPs are only eligible for NG9-1-1 migration expenses to facilitate regional deployments based on the selective routers. They would not be eligible to receive funding for anything else, such as call handling equipment or consolidation projects. And to recognizing that we're estimating 3 years for deployments to occur across the Commonwealth, funding awards for the NG9-1-1 Migration Program are for 3 years. An NG9-1-1 funding request consists of a migration proposal and a completed proposal acceptance letter. The migration proposals identify NG9-1-1 migration needs and related costs. This document, for the most part, determines the scope of the NG9-1-1 funding request. In order to complete the funding request, PSAPs will need to accept the information that's contained in the migration proposal and the cost estimate by completing a proposal acceptance letter. A copy of the proposal acceptance letter, or PAL, is available from the PSAP Grant Program webpage on the ISP website. Since the migration proposal is such an integral component for the NG9-1-1 migration funding program, I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes reviewing the migration proposal. The purpose of the migration proposal is identified in the guidelines document. It is captured in the definition section and in the NG9-1-1 Migration Program brief. The prerequisite work needed within the PSAP is contained in the migration proposal, and as I mentioned, this would include any non-vendor supported call handling equipment and plan consolidation projects. The information in the migration proposal provides the PSAPs with information about the AT&T NG9-1-1 solution. So some of the prerequisite work that will be captured in the migration proposal has to do with PSAP systems and applications. These need to be compatible with NG9-1-1. So each major system is assessed for its readiness and outlines any upgrade that must or could be implemented with NG9-1-1. So that information is captured in the migration proposal. The document also provides current match rates for road center line and address points, the 10 addresses with the most discrepancies, and the results of 5 GIS data reviews that AT&T conducts on the GIS data to ensure that there are no errors that would cause issues or uncertainty when routing a 911 call. So in addition to evaluating PSAP systems and applications, what I've just covered would fall under the GIS data review. And the ultimate goal is for all PSAPs to use geospatial I3 routing for all 911 calls. If a PSAP's call handling equipment is not NG9-1-1 capable or the GIS data is not ready for deployment, a PSAP can still deploy, and we need for them to deploy along with other PSAPs in their selective router region, but it would have to be with an interim solution for call delivery. And there are two interim solutions, a legacy network gateway or transitional SIP. Again, this information, the call routing portion, would be covered in the migration proposal. And then there would also be information to address network redundancy and diversity in the proposal document. So using the deployment schedule as a guide, ISP staff has begun distributing migration proposals. We've been moving from east to west across the Commonwealth by selective router region. Those of you who are familiar with this deployment schedule would know that we're preparing the migration proposals for Tidewater and the Richmond PSAPs, since these are the first two deployment areas. As I said, the migration proposal distribution is an ongoing process, and we should have all the migration proposals to all Virginia PSAPs completed by the end of August. And once a migration proposal has been completed for your PSAP, excuse me, you can apply for a grant based on what's listed on it. However, based on interactions with your RC, the document may be updated. So since we've begun the migration proposal distribution process, ISP staff has heard from several PSAPs that vendors have been reaching out to them with proposals to address GIS data-related needs. We would encourage PSAPs, if they do receive a proposal, to provide their RC with a copy of the proposal so the RC and other ISP staff members have this information on hand when they meet with the PSAP and other members of the locality to discuss the locality's migration proposal. Since we're talking about NG9-1-1 data readiness here, I did want to mention that in addition to the migration proposals, localities will also be receiving GIS data report cards. These reports are broader than the GIS data information or GIS data assessment information that's provided in the migration proposal. The GIS data report cards provide localities with a broader assessment of their GIS data. It assesses the data submissions that localities provided to VGen earlier this year, and localities ALI and MSAG data that was acquired by VGen from the 911 service providers in March of this year. The GIS data report card provides an assessment of GIS data readiness for NG9-1-1 But as I said, it's a broader document than just NG9-1 GIS data readiness. Information is provided as far as conformance of GIS data sets to the Virginia Geospatial Data Standards. However, as I mentioned in the first slide, that the NG9-1-1 Migration Program is specifically focused on NG9-1-1 funding and the need to transition PSAPs. The GIS data portion of the migration proposal focuses exclusively on what needs to happen as far as where PSAPs are in terms of their match rates for road centerline and address points. The desired match rate is 98%. The migration proposal provides information on these match rates as well as 5 additional measures. But additional information will be provided on the GIS data report card on an ISP webinar next Wednesday, August the 8th. The intended audience for this webinar is local government GIS and 911 professionals. We'll also be providing a separate webinar on August the 15th to provide information to the vendor community. So looking at the NG9-1 Migration Program, we're focusing on what we need to do, what localities need to do to obtain that 98% match rate for road centerline and address points, as well as the 5 additional measures that are captured in the migration proposal. Any additional items that may be provided or relevant to the GIS data report card would need to be addressed with local funding. And as I said, additional information on these items will be provided on upcoming ISP webinars. Before we leave the discussion on NG9-1-1 GIS data readiness, I just want to mention that MENA has issued a GIS data exchange standard. I mention this only for awareness. As long as existing GIS data and workflows address the mandatory applicable conditional fields and legacy fields, the impact of this new standard is minimal, and additional information on this new standard will be provided on upcoming GIS-focused webinars. So to jump back to the other piece of the proposal acceptance letter, of the funding request, which is the proposal acceptance letter. This document functions as the NG9-1-1 funding request. The amount requested in the PAL should not exceed the cost estimates that are contained in the migration proposal. Those cost estimates are based on an appropriate and allowable scope for NG9-1-1. By submitting a proposal acceptance letter, the PSAP is confirming the acceptance of the information and the cost estimates contained in the migration proposal and signals the intent of the PSAP's intent to deploy NG9-1-1. The proposal acceptance letter also has an option for PSAP to indicate how they would like to address payments on behalf of the PSAP for incurred eligible NG9-1-1 expenses. Many of the items included in the migration proposal, the cost estimates and subsequent invoices could be handled as far as a direct bill. In other words, the 911 Services Board would be able to pay for these services on behalf of the PSAP. So when localities are looking at that proposal acceptance letter, that's one of the pieces of information that we need in order to process that funding request. An electronic copy of the proposal acceptance letter, or PAL, is available from the PSAP Grant Program webpage. Some additional items that I want to make everybody aware of related to the PAL is that when the board approves the funding request or the PAL, one of the expectations is that a PSAP or locality would need to execute a contract with an NG9-1-1 solutions provider within 3 months of that PAL being approved. Also, all of the items identified in the migration proposal that need to be addressed, all of those identified NG9-1-1 ready implementation steps would need to be completed within 3 months of the scheduled deployment date. Contingency funding is also available, and should the final cost of deployment be slightly higher than identified in the migration proposal and the proposal acceptance letter, there wouldn't be an issue as long as the original scope has not changed. If the final cost is lower than the budget for the PSAP or locality, would be adjusted downward. However, any residual funding cannot be shifted to another part of the project. And if during the deployment process the PSAP migration proposal needs to be revised for a material change after the funding request from the PSAP has been approved by the board, an additional PAL would need to be submitted by that PSAP to obtain any additional funding. And if the PSAP needs additional time to execute the contract, which is a condition of the proposal acceptance letter, the PSAP would need to request an extension for the board. Before I move on to talking about the NG9-1-1 funding cycle, I wanted to pause and ask the webinar participants if you had any questions or comments related to the material. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to the NG9-1-1 funding cycle. The funding cycle for the NG9-1-1 migration program needs to support the deployment schedule if we are going to be successful. So the funding cycle for the NG9-1-1 migration program began on July 16th, and it will remain open throughout the deployment period. The board approved an extended funding request cycle to ensure that all PSAPs have sufficient time to apply for funding. Right now, ISP staff is focusing on the initial funding process, and we will address amendments and award closeouts with the PSAP Grant Committee at future meetings. We'll begin the discussion related to amendments at the upcoming PSAP Grant Committee meeting in September. As I said, the focus right now is on the opening up the funding cycle. The initial submission date for PALs is September the 17th. Right now, ISP's focus is providing an opportunity for localities to submit PALs in 2018. ISP staff will publish additional PAL submission deadline dates for the entire deployment period as we set up 911 Services Board meetings, and PSAP should submit their PALs as they have done with grant applications in the past to the PSAP Grant electronic mailbox. The address is listed here. The deadline is always 5 p.m. on the deadline. As a reminder to folks participating, can you mute your lines, please? There's a little bit of background noise. So the first PAL submission date is September the 17th, 2018. We're targeting, ISP staff is targeting the November board meeting for the first wave of NG9-1-1 funding approvals. Since there wasn't enough time to complete the review process for the September 13th board meeting. So the first submission deadline date for NG9-1-1 funding request will be September the 17th, 2018, and the board will review and make awards at their November 8th, 2018 meeting. And as I already mentioned, ISP staff will announce additional PAL deadline dates when future board meetings are scheduled. That's an overview of the NG9-1-1 Migration Program. Before I move on to the PSAP Education Program, I wanted to stop and ask webinar participants if you had any questions. Moving on to the PSAP Education Program. This program provides funding to primary PSAPs for the purpose of obtaining 911 NGIS education and training. Just like secondary PSAPs cannot apply for call handling equipment projects or participating consolidation projects and receive funding for those. Secondary PSAPs are not eligible for PEP funding. Now, there has been one change to the PEP as a result of a recommendation that came from a PSAP Grant Committee member. The funding for PEP grants has increased. The reason for the increase, quite frankly, was to address the rising costs to attend conferences and training opportunities. So an individual PEP request would be $3,000, and for PSAPs participating in a multi-jurisdictional PEP, it would be $4,000 per primary PSAP. This is an increase of $1,000 per primary PSAP for an individual PEP request, as well as a $1,000 increase for PSAPs participating in a multi-jurisdictional PEP project. Now, with the NG9-1-1 Migration Program, it is an ongoing funding cycle. The PEP grant application cycle is not ongoing. It maintains the same deadline date as it was in fiscal year 19. The deadline is 5 p.m. on October the 1st, 2018. The funding cycle for the PEP grant application opened up on July 1st of this year. The PEP application is available from the PSAP Grant Program website on the ISP website, and just like any other grant application, you would need to submit it to the PSAP Grant electronic mailbox. Any questions about the PSAP Education Program? Okay. I'm going to move on then to the annual progress report. PSAPs with open non-PEP grant awards are required to complete an annual progress report. The regional coordinators are aware of the open grants for their constituents and have been working with them to complete these reports. A copy of the report is available from the PSAP Grant webpage. The deadline is fast approaching. It is this Friday at 5 p.m. Again, PSAP should submit their completed reports to the PSAP Grant electronic mailbox. The process for the annual progress report is very similar to the process we used last year, with one exception. GIS projects are the exception, and we are asking localities with GIS projects to identify how the grant supports the 2018 GIS report card, GIS data report card, and progress made by the locality towards NG9-1-1. And just to remind everybody about the criteria, this is the same review criteria that we used last year, but if a PSAP has not reached the design planning phase that is included in the implementation plan on the report, ISP staff will recommend the grant be rescinded. If the PSAP has not reached the acquisition phase, the PSAP must provide a revised project plan, and these project plans will be reviewed by the PSAP Grant Committee at their September meeting. This meeting is scheduled to occur on September the 6th. So, two takeaways from the discussion on, or the presentation on the annual progress report. The deadline is fast approaching this Friday, 5 p.m. So if you haven't submitted your annual progress report, we need to have it by 5 p.m. on Friday. And just to make sure everybody understands that they may need to submit a revised project plan if they have not reached the acquisition phase. The Grant Committee will be reviewing these revised project plans at their September meeting. Any questions about or comments about the annual progress report? Well, the last item I wanted to cover today was on the fiscal year 18 TrueUp process. The annual progress report remained very similar to the process that we used in fiscal year 19. The TrueUp process for this year is different than the process that we used last year. The reporting period is the current reporting period is for fiscal year 18, which closed on June 30th, 2018. The data collection for this year's TrueUp process is based on the new wireless 911 funding formula, which is based on population and total 911 calls. The population data that we're using is or has been obtained from the Weldon Cooper Center. So the only call data that ISP staff will be collecting is the total number of 911 calls received during fiscal year 18. The good news is with this year's TrueUp process, most of the work will be done by ISP staff. ISP staff will be able to complete a TrueUp for most PSAPs using ECaTS data. However, each MIS system has unique criteria for how reports are generated. So fiscal year 18 is a rebaselining year for call load data. So there may be some shifts in call load data as far as total 911 calls from fiscal year 17 to fiscal year 18. But this shift would be uniform, and the end result is that ECaTS produces a uniform representation of call load data across all PSAPs. In reviewing ECaTS reports for each PSAP, it is determined that there is any missing data. ISP staff will use existing ECaTS data to estimate the missing data. In addition, ISP staff may also request a PSAP to provide missing data from their native MIS system for comparison. But the punchline for the PSAP community is that there is no TrueUp deadline this year. As I said, ISP staff will be preparing the TrueUps on behalf of the PSAP. We will post a statewide data spreadsheet by September the 7th, 2018, and we'll provide PSAPs until October the 12th, 2018 to review the data and provide any discrepancies or issues or comments on the data. And that's an overview of this year's TrueUp process. Any questions about this year's TrueUp process? Any questions regarding any information we covered today on the fiscal year 20 PSAP Grant Program, the NG9-1-1 Migration Program, the PFF Education Program, the annual reporting period for the fiscal year 18 program? Well, everybody, thank you for your time this afternoon. Steve, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. If there aren't any other questions, I just want to mention that we do have other upcoming webinars. We will be, as Dorothy mentioned, we're going to be having a webinar in a couple weeks to talk about the GIS report card and how to go about interpreting it and utilizing it. We're also going to be having, we've had a lot of interest from some of the GIS vendors, GIS service vendors out there about the report card and helping localities improve their data. And we just want to make sure that they understand where the limits of the funding from VITA are for that. I want to make clear that through all of this process, whether it's the migration proposals or the GIS report cards, what we're providing you is information. You're in charge. You are the one who makes the decision as to what how you want to proceed, and exactly how you want to address your GIS data and so forth, you're going to have to do something. We don't have a choice anymore about whether you're going to go to next generation 9-1 or not. You're going to. Everyone is going to have to. And now it's a question of what's the best way for you and your locality to do that. As Dorothy mentioned, we need to do it by selective router region because we got to contain costs. Otherwise, we can't afford to do it. So we need to make sure that we understand all of those piece parts together. We did get an update this week from Virginia Beach that they are still planning to move forward. They don't have a schedule right now of when it will be released and reviewed and awarded, but they are working on that, and as soon as Stephen Williams provides that to us, we'll provide that out, and we may in fact have a webinar to make sure that everybody understands the schedule and what to expect and things like that once it moves a little bit further along in the process. But, this is a lot going on right now. As Dorothy said, we got migration proposal, we got the TrueUps, we got the GIS report cards. We're collecting more GIS data. We're putting out the migration proposals. We're meeting with localities. It is a very busy time. So please stay informed. If you have suggestions for other webinars that you'd like to see, we don't want to be totally wrapped up with everything next gen. If there's other areas you'd like us to focus on or provide information, please let Melissa Parsons know. She leads that effort for us. And are there any last questions about anything that we can do for you? If not, thank you all very much for your time and have a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone.